The courtroom of Santa Monica County was packed to capacity, buzzing with anticipation. This wasn't just any legal battle. It was Morgan Freeman, a Hollywood legend, standing at the plaintiff's table. People whispered among themselves, some elbowing their neighbors, others sneaking glances at their phones to capture the moment. Outside, news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, waiting to beam any juicy developments to the world. Before we dive into this incredible true story of justice, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly legal drama stories featuring Hollywood legends standing up to corporate giants. Morgan Freeman had faced villains on screen for over 6 decades, but today, his adversary wasn't a fictional character. It was the legal system itself. The lawsuit he had filed was anything but straightforward, a deeply personal property dispute with painful origins. Tech billionaire Alexander Ripley, famous for his controversial AI startup NeuralSphere and his viral TikTok pranks, had encroached on Freeman's land in Malibu, constructing part of a luxury AI research facility where it didn't belong. What Ripley didn't know was that this particular piece of land held the last memories Freeman had of his late wife. The small cottage where they'd spent their final summer together stood in the shadow of Ripley's imposing glass and steel monstrosity. Freeman had tried to handle it the civil way. Letters, calls, formal complaints, but his warnings had been mocked and ignored. Now he was in court, prepared to argue his own case, fighting not just for property rights, but for something much more sacred. The atmosphere was electric as Judge Patricia Winters finally entered the room. A stern woman in her 60s who'd made headlines last year for her controversial rulings on several high-profile tech cases, Judge Winters had been on the bench for decades and had seen all kinds of cases. But this was different. She adjusted her glasses, eyeing the famed actor turned plaintiff. A smirk played on her lips. "Mr. Freeman," she began, tapping her gavel once, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom. "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter?" Freeman, standing tall despite his 86 years, simply nodded, his rich, deep voice resonating through the room. "That's right, Your Honor." A chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others grinned, waiting for what they assumed would be a spectacular train wreck. Even Ripley, seated at the defense table with his high-powered attorney, let out a small laugh and whispered something to his lawyer that made them both smirk. Judge Winters leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "You do understand that legal proceedings are not the same as Hollywood scripts, don't you? There are rules, procedures, complexities that even seasoned attorneys struggle with. It's not as simple as delivering a monologue and riding off into the sunset." The laughter grew louder, but Freeman remained unshaken, his eyes steady and determined. As reporters scribbled notes and one even whispered, "This is going to be gold," Freeman let the laughter play out, waiting for the room to settle. Then in a voice calm and measured, the same voice that had narrated the journeys of penguins and the lives of presidents, he spoke. "I know the rules, Your Honor, and I know the law." Judge Winters raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And where did you study law, Mr. Freeman?" The courtroom chuckles turned to outright laughter. Freeman didn't react. Instead, he reached into his case file, pulling out a neatly bound stack of documents. He placed them on the table before him, tapping the top page lightly with his fingers. "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing every property law that applies to this case. I've read the California coastal zoning codes. I've studied precedent, and I have more than enough evidence to prove that my land has been unlawfully encroached upon." His voice remained steady, unwavering. "Now I'm here to present that evidence. If this court is about justice, then let's get to it." The laughter died down. For the first time, the courtroom began to realize something. Morgan Freeman wasn't here for theatrics. He wasn't here to amuse them. He was here to win. Judge Winters cleared her throat, suddenly feeling the weight of her earlier mockery. "Very well, Mr. Freeman, let's proceed." Freeman sat down, his expression unreadable. But as the murmurs of the crowd faded and the trial officially began, there was one undeniable fact hanging in the air. This was no ordinary case, and Morgan Freeman was no ordinary man. Judge Patricia Winters adjusted her robe and glanced down at Morgan Freeman, still mildly amused by the actor's decision to represent himself. She had expected Freeman to sputter and stumble through legal jargon, grasping at straws in a courtroom that wasn't designed for movie stars. But something about the way Freeman sat, calm, composed, and utterly unshaken, gave the judge pause. "Mr. Freeman, you may proceed with your opening statement," Judge Winters said, leaning back in her chair, expecting an awkward, half-baked monologue. Freeman stood slowly, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him. He didn't rush. He let the silence hang, a trick he had mastered in countless films. The weight of his presence alone forced the room into a hush. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, and deliberate. "In 2016, I purchased a stretch of land in Malibu," he began, his eyes fixed on the judge. "The property lines were clearly documented. Over the years, I've maintained that land, paid taxes on it, and ensured it was kept in line with local regulations. But last year, Mr. Ripley and his company decided my property wasn't mine anymore." He pulled a set of documents from his case file, setting them on the table with quiet precision. "Ripley's company built on my land without my consent. They ignored boundaries, ignored permits, ignored me. I sent formal warnings, legal notices, and requests to cease construction." His voice lowered slightly. "They ignored those too." The courtroom, once filled with chuckles and sneers, had gone silent. The spectators, the journalists, even Ripley's own legal team. Everyone was listening now. Freeman continued, pulling out aerial photographs taken over time. "These images show the land before and after construction began. This," he pointed to the markings on the images, "is my property line. And this," he slid another photo forward, showing the gradual creep of the construction into his land, "is Ripley's development." Alexander Ripley's attorney, Victoria Parker, cleared her throat and stood. A tall, lean woman in a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She exuded the confidence of a corporate lawyer used to steamroll in cases like these. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, her voice smooth as silk. Freeman raised a hand without looking at her. "I'm not done." The interruption was so unexpected that Parker froze, blinking. The judge hesitated, then nodded for Freeman to continue. Freeman reached into his stack and pulled out email correspondence, letters between his representatives and Ripley's company. "This is a record of every attempt I made to resolve this issue before bringing it to court." He looked up at Ripley, their eyes meeting across the room. They had every opportunity to do the right thing. They chose not to. Parker scoffed, regaining her composure. "Your Honor, if I may address this." Judge Winters nodded, and Parker turned toward Freeman with a smirk. "Mr. Freeman, you've certainly done your homework, and I applaud the effort. But with all due respect, you're not an attorney. These legal matters are complex. You're presenting evidence, sure, but do you even understand the nuances of California property law?" Freeman leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Parker. "I understand the law just fine, and I understand when someone's breaking it." Parker chuckled and shook her head. "You think this is like one of your movies, don't you? A lone man standing up against the system?" She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally object to this entire charade. This case deserves a proper trial, not a performance." Judge Winters looked at Freeman. "Do you have a response, Mr. Freeman?" Freeman nodded. "Yeah. You want a performance? Go watch one of my films. This," he gestured around the courtroom, "this is real, and I take real things seriously." The judge exhaled, rubbing her temples. She had expected a show, but instead she was seeing something else entirely. A man who had spent his life embodying justice on screen, now demanding it in real life. "Very well," Winters said finally. "Mr. Freeman, you may proceed." Freeman took his seat, his face unreadable, but he could sense the shift in the room. They weren't laughing anymore. Judge Patricia Winters sat back in her chair, rubbing her chin as she processed what had just unfolded in her courtroom. When Morgan Freeman had first declared he would be representing himself, Winters had been certain this case would be nothing more than an amusing spectacle. A Hollywood legend stumbling through legal procedures he didn't understand. But now, just minutes into the trial, that assumption was crumbling. The courtroom, which had been alive with chuckles and murmurs earlier, was now eerily silent. The laughter had faded as quickly as it had begun, replaced by an uncomfortable realization. Freeman wasn't here to play celebrity. He wasn't delivering scripted lines or putting on an act. He was a man who had spent decades learning the art of justice, both in film and in life, and he was executing his case with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Judge Winters leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "All right, Mr. Freeman," she said, her tone more measured now. "You've laid out your argument. Ms. Parker, do you wish to respond?" Victoria Parker, the polished corporate attorney representing Alexander Ripley, smirked as she stood. She wasn't rattled, at least not yet. "Your Honor, while I appreciate Mr. Freeman's confidence, this case is a bit more complicated than he's making it out to be." She turned to face the courtroom, exuding the ease of a woman used to winning. "What we have here is a simple misunderstanding about property lines. Now, I understand Mr. Freeman believes his land was encroached upon, but we have extensive documentation that proves otherwise." She gestured to her own stack of legal papers, neatly bound in expensive leather folders. "Mr. Freeman has done an admirable job of assembling his case, but I must remind the court that legal practice isn't as simple as reading a few law books. The law is about interpretation, precedent, and most importantly, expertise." She paused for effect, and respectfully, Mr. Freeman is not an expert. She turned toward Freeman, smiling condescendingly. "Now, Mr. Freeman, I understand you've played wise mentors and prison escapees throughout your career, and I have to admit, I've enjoyed some of your films." She chuckled lightly. "But this isn't Shawshank Redemption, and it certainly isn't Bruce Almighty. This is real life, and in real life, you can't just narrate your way out of a legal dispute." The courtroom laughed again, though this time it was more forced, an attempt by Parker to reclaim the room. Freeman, sitting at his table, didn't smile, didn't blink. He simply adjusted the papers in front of him, methodical as ever. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate. "You're right," Freeman said, his tone measured. "This isn't a movie." He stood up slowly, resting both hands on the table. "And I'm not here to entertain you, Ms. Parker." The laughter stopped. Freeman picked up a stack of legal documents and began flipping through them. "You want to talk about expertise? Let's talk about facts." He pulled out a large aerial photograph of his property before the construction had started. "This is my land in 2020. My boundaries are here." He pointed at the clear property lines marked and legally recorded. Then he picked up another photo. "This is my land in 2023. You see that?" He pointed to the area where Ripley's development had extended past the boundary line. "That's your client's building, on my property." Parker shifted slightly, but Freeman wasn't done. He pulled out a printout of an email. "This is the cease and desist notice I sent to Ripley's company when construction first started creeping past my property line." No response. He flipped to another page. "This is the second notice. No response." He flipped to a third. "This is the third." He looked up, staring Parker down. "You see a pattern here?" The lawyer cleared her throat. "Mr. Freeman, property disputes are rarely this black and white. There are complexities in the law that—" Freeman raised his hand, cutting her off. "You ignored the law until you got caught." The room was still. Even Judge Winters seemed taken aback. She had seen her fair share of self-represented litigants, but none had ever carried themselves with the kind of unflinching confidence Morgan Freeman did. He wasn't floundering. He wasn't unsure. He was methodical, precise, and above all, right. Parker forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Your Honor, I think we're getting a little carried away here. This is still just an opening argument, and while Mr. Freeman certainly knows how to command a room, we're dealing with legal technicalities here." Judge Winters, who had initially viewed this case as a novelty, was no longer so sure. She folded her hands together, glancing between Parker and Freeman. For the first time, she felt a twinge of regret for underestimating the man standing before her. "Very well," the judge said. "Ms. Parker, you will have the opportunity to present your defense soon enough, but for now I'd like to continue hearing from Mr. Freeman." Freeman gave a small nod and took his seat, his face unreadable. But even as Parker sat back down, shifting uncomfortably, one thing had become painfully clear. The judge had made a mistake by underestimating Morgan Freeman, and she wasn't the only one. By the time court adjourned for the day, the story had already spread like wildfire. News crews camped outside the Santa Monica courthouse, their cameras rolling as reporters delivered breathless updates. The headlines practically wrote themselves. "Go ahead, make my case. Hollywood icon stuns courtroom. Judge underestimated Freeman and now she regrets it. Red pill, blue pill, or the truth. Freeman schools tech billionaire in court." Social media exploded. Clips from inside the courtroom, some taken illegally by eager spectators, circulated online, showing Freeman presenting his evidence while his opposition floundered. Freeman's justice and David vs. Goliath started trending within hours. Legal analysts debated the case on television, some amused, others impressed. "Look, no one expected Morgan Freeman to walk in and actually know the law," one analyst commented on CNN. "But the man has clearly done his homework. He's disciplined, precise, and let's be honest, he commands that courtroom better than some attorneys I've seen." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as soon as Freeman stepped through the doors. "Mr. Freeman, did you expect to make such a strong impression?" He adjusted his glasses and gave a small shrug. "I just came to tell the truth." "Do you really think you can win this case without a lawyer?" another reporter asked. Freeman paused, turning to face the cameras fully. "Justice isn't about how expensive your lawyer is," he said. "It's about what's right." Then he walked to his car, ignoring the sea of flashing lights. The following morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Reporters filled the gallery, eager to see if Freeman's momentum would continue or if the defense would finally put him on the back foot. Victoria Parker was done playing nice. She straightened her tie and walked up to the judge's bench, her Louboutin heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to enter a motion," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the confidence that came with her $1,200 per hour fee. "Given the media frenzy surrounding this case, I believe it's necessary to ensure that we're operating in a strictly legal capacity. I move that Mr. Freeman be required to retain legal counsel or withdraw his claim." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Winters glanced at Freeman. "Mr. Freeman, do you have a response?" Freeman stood, hands resting lightly on the table. "I do," he said, voice steady. "This is a public court. The public is watching, sure. But the media didn't put Ripley's buildings on my land. The media didn't ignore my cease and desist letters. And the media sure as hell didn't file this lawsuit. I did." He looked directly at Parker. "You want me to get a lawyer because I'm making you nervous?" Parker gave a tight-lipped smile. "Hardly. I'm simply stating that the legal process is complex. Even seasoned lawyers struggle with it." Freeman nodded. "I imagine they do." He picked up his file and pulled out another document. "But last I checked, the Constitution doesn't say I need a lawyer to defend my own property. Unless, of course, you think a man can't stand up for himself anymore." The murmur in the room grew louder. Judge Winters cleared her throat. "Ms. Parker, while I understand your concerns, Mr. Freeman has every right to represent himself." Parker clenched her jaw, realizing she had just lost another round. As the morning session continued, Freeman called his first witness, Jacob Reynolds, a retired land surveyor who had worked in Los Angeles County for over 30 years. He had personally surveyed Freeman's property multiple times. "Mr. Reynolds," Freeman said, walking up to the witness stand, "you've reviewed the property records and my land surveys, correct?" "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied. "I've worked with Mr. Freeman for decades. His property line has remained unchanged since he purchased it in 2016. Freeman nodded and held up a document. "Can you confirm that this is the original property deed?" Reynolds took a glance and nodded. "Yes, this clearly states that the land in question belongs to Mr. Freeman." Freeman turned to the jury. "That's the law right there in black and white." Parker shot up from her chair. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Freeman is not qualified to interpret legal documents in front of the jury." Judge Winters hesitated but ultimately sighed. "Sustained. Mr. Freeman, let's keep this line of questioning within proper legal boundaries." Freeman nodded. "Fine. Let's keep it simple." He turned back to Reynolds. "Has there ever been a legal dispute over my property line before?" "No," Reynolds said firmly. Freeman turned back to the judge. "No further questions?" Parker stood, buttoning her suit jacket. She walked toward Reynolds, flashing a confident smile. "Mr. Reynolds, you've been a land surveyor for a long time, haven't you?" 35 years, Reynolds confirmed. "And in that time, have you ever seen cases where property lines were misinterpreted?" "Maybe not intentionally, but mistakes happen, don't they?" Reynolds shifted slightly. "Sometimes, but not in this case. The lines are clear." Parker nodded. "That's your opinion." Freeman leaned back in his chair, watching as Parker tried to poke holes in testimony that simply didn't have any. After a few more failed attempts at undermining the witness, Parker sighed. No further questions. As the day's session ended, Judge Winters once again found herself studying Morgan Freeman. The courtroom had been stacked against him from the beginning. No formal legal training, no high-powered law firm backing him, but none of that had stopped him from taking control of the case. Winters had thought this was going to be another instance of a self-represented litigant fumbling through procedures, making a mess of things before ultimately losing. But Freeman wasn't losing. He was winning. And as the gavel came down, Winters realized something else. Hollywood might have taught Morgan Freeman how to deliver justice on screen, but out here in real life, the system wasn't ready for him. By the time Morgan Freeman called Alexander Ripley to the stand, the courtroom had settled into a strange tension. No one was laughing anymore. The air crackled with the realization that Freeman wasn't just holding his own. He was pressing forward, unshaken, unrelenting. Ripley, a wealthy tech mogul in his mid-30s, walked up to the witness stand with the same cocky air that had made him billions in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that somehow still managed to look casual, he adjusted his designer glasses before taking his seat. His attorney, Victoria Parker, approached first. "Mr. Ripley, let's clarify something for the court. Is it your belief that your company has acted within the law in its construction efforts?" Ripley nodded smoothly. "Absolutely. We conducted a full legal review before beginning the project. We're pioneers in ethical AI development, and that extends to all aspects of our business." Parker smiled. "So in your expert opinion, is it possible that Mr. Freeman is simply mistaken about the boundaries of his own property?" "I think that's a fair assumption," Ripley replied, smirking slightly as he glanced at Freeman. "It's a complicated area with lots of similar parcels." The courtroom murmured. Freeman sat at his table, hands folded, watching, waiting. "No further questions," Parker said, stepping back. "Your witness, Mr. Freeman." A hush fell over the courtroom as Freeman slowly rose from his seat. He didn't grab his papers, didn't even glance at his notes. He simply strode toward the witness stand with the same quiet confidence he'd carried for decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Ripley," he said, "you just testified that you believe I'm mistaken about my own land." Ripley smirked again. "That's right." Freeman nodded slightly, then walked over to the evidence table where the aerial photos were neatly stacked. He picked up the first image, the one showing the untouched land before construction began, and held it up. "Do you recognize this?" Ripley barely glanced at it. "Looks like an overhead shot of some property." Freeman's eyes narrowed. "Not some property, my property, taken before your company started building." He held the image closer to Ripley, forcing him to look at it. Ripley shrugged. "If you say so." Freeman remained unfazed. He reached for another image, this one taken after construction had begun. It showed the skeletal framework of the AI research facility creeping over the property line. "How about this one?" Freeman asked, stepping closer. Ripley shifted slightly in his seat. "I'd assume that's from our development project." Freeman nodded again, holding the two photos side by side. "And can you explain why part of your development is sitting on my land?" Ripley exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed. "Mr. Freeman, property disputes happen all the time. Lines get blurred. It's a complicated business." Freeman took a step forward. "Blurred," he repeated. His voice remained calm, but there was steel in it. He turned and looked at the jury. "Boundaries don't get blurred by accident. They get ignored." Freeman placed the photos down carefully and picked up a document, his official cease and desist letter sent to Ripley's company months before the lawsuit. "Did you receive this letter?" Ripley hesitated, then sighed. "I'm sure our legal team handled it." That's not what I asked, Freeman replied evenly. Did you personally receive this letter? Ripley shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I suppose I did. Freeman turned toward the jury again. And after receiving this letter, after I made it clear that you were building on land that wasn't yours, did you stop construction? Ripley's jaw tightened. Freeman let the silence hang. Finally, Ripley cleared his throat. No, he admitted. Another murmur rippled through the courtroom. Freeman didn't react, didn't press. He let the jury absorb that answer in full. After a long pause, he simply said, "No further questions." As Freeman walked back to his seat, he caught the expressions of the jury members. They had been skeptical at first, some even amused. Now they were leaning forward, their faces serious. Judge Winters rubbed her forehead, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. She had underestimated Freeman. Ripley's lawyer had underestimated him. Everyone had. And now, piece by piece, Freeman was dismantling the defense's case. Parker stood, visibly irritated. She buttoned her jacket and approached Ripley. "Mr. Ripley," she began, her voice smoother than before. "To be clear, at the time construction began, was it your understanding that you were within your legal rights?" Ripley straightened his tie. "Yes." "And did you knowingly, deliberately violate property laws?" Ripley shook his head. Any misunderstanding of the property lines was just that, a misunderstanding." Parker nodded, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is a businessman. He operates within the law to the best of his ability. There was never any intent to break the law, and any mistakes made were purely incidental." Freeman leaned back in his chair, watching. He had already made his point. No further objections were needed. Judge Winters sighed. "We'll continue proceedings after a brief recess." She banged the gavel, and the courtroom erupted into chatter. As Freeman stood to stretch, a reporter in the gallery whispered to a colleague, "This isn't just a property case anymore. It's Morgan Freeman versus Big Tech." Another reporter nodded. "And he's winning." Meanwhile, at the defense table, Parker leaned in close to Ripley. "We need to reconsider our strategy," she muttered. "If we don't shut him down soon, this case is going to spin completely out of control." Ripley scowled, his confidence cracking. "Do whatever you have to." Across the courtroom, Freeman sat back down, calm as ever. He wasn't worried. He wasn't flustered, because he knew one thing. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to fight dirty. You just need to let the facts speak for themselves. By the time the court reconvened, the tension in the room had shifted. The smug confidence Victoria Parker had walked in with that morning had begun to fray at the edges. Alexander Ripley, the tech mogul who had once dismissed Morgan Freeman as nothing more than an aging actor playing pretend in a courtroom, now sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched. Freeman, on the other hand, was as composed as ever. He sat at his table, his hands folded in front of him, his demeanor unchanged. While the defense strategized in hushed tones, he simply watched, calm, patient, unshaken. Judge Patricia Winters rubbed her temples before turning her attention to Parker. "Ms. Parker, you may proceed with your next witness." Parker stood, buttoning her suit jacket, and turned to the courtroom. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense calls James Whitaker, a senior land assessor, to the stand." A balding man in his early 60s walked up to the witness stand, his expression neutral as he was sworn in. Parker adjusted her tie and stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, you've been a land assessor for over 35 years, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Whitaker replied. "And in that time, have you come across cases where property disputes have been misinterpreted due to outdated surveys or inaccurate boundary markers?" "Of course," Whitaker said, nodding. "It happens more often than people think. Even legally recorded boundaries can sometimes be subject to minor adjustments based on updated surveys." Parker turned toward the jury, gesturing subtly as if guiding them toward her conclusion. "Would you say it's possible that Mr. Freeman's claim, while understandable, may be based on an outdated interpretation of his property's true legal boundary?" Whitaker hesitated. "I would say it's possible," he admitted. Parker smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. No further questions." She stepped back confidently, her posture straight. For the first time since the trial had begun, it looked like she had scored a point for the defense. But Morgan Freeman was already rising from his chair. He approached the witness stand at a slow, deliberate pace, his boots tapping softly against the polished wood floor. When he reached the stand, he rested his hands on the rail in front of him, locking eyes with Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," he said evenly, "how often would you say developers like Mr. Ripley attempt to push past legal property lines?" Whitaker blinked. "Excuse me?" "You've been a land assessor for 35 years, Freeman continued. "In that time, how often have you seen developers knowingly build over property lines, assuming the other guy won't fight back?" Whitaker hesitated. He glanced at Ripley, then at Parker before clearing his throat. I can't say for sure." Freeman nodded. "Let me help you out." He pulled out a document and laid it on the witness stand. "This is a record of past property disputes involving NeuralSphere Corporation. Would you care to read the number of times they've been accused of boundary violations?" Whitaker picked up the document and adjusted his glasses. His eyes scanned the page, and his face tensed slightly. "There are 5 recorded disputes." Freeman arched an eyebrow. 5? And how many of those cases were settled out of court?" Whitaker swallowed. "All of them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Freeman turned toward the jury. "So we're not talking about some innocent misunderstanding here. We're talking about a pattern, a man who's been caught before and has paid his way out every time." Parker shot up from her seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant. Prior disputes have no bearing on this case." Judge Winters sighed. She had to admit Freeman had made a compelling point. "Overruled. Mr. Freeman, please keep your questions focused on the case at hand." Freeman nodded. He turned back to Whitaker. "One more question. Have you personally reviewed the official survey of my land?" Whitaker hesitated. "Not personally, no." Freeman nodded again and turned to the judge. "No further questions?" As he walked back to his table, Parker looked visibly frustrated. Her own witness had just admitted he hadn't even reviewed the critical piece of evidence. Parker took a deep breath and approached Ripley, who was already whispering angrily. "This is a joke," Ripley muttered. "I pay you to win, not to let some movie star make us look like fools." Parker clenched her jaw, speaking low. "Relax. He got in a few good shots, but we're still ahead." Ripley narrowed his eyes. "Are we?" Parker didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to enter our closing arguments." Judge Winters exhaled slowly, nodding. "Very well, Miss Parker. You may begin." Parker straightened her jacket and turned toward the jury, launching into a carefully rehearsed monologue. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've all been entertained over the past few days. We've seen Mr. Freeman put on quite a show. But let's be clear, justice isn't a movie. It isn't about theatrics or emotion. It's about the law, and the law isn't on Mr. Freeman's side." She gestured to the courtroom. "We live in a world of complexities. Property laws, boundary disputes, legal interpretations. These things require expertise. And while Mr. Freeman has presented a passionate case, passion alone doesn't prove legal ownership." Parker nodded confidently. "My client followed the necessary steps to begin construction. Any claims otherwise are misunderstandings, not malice. And while we respect Mr. Freeman's commitment to this case, we urge you to focus on the facts, not the spectacle." With that, she turned and walked back to her table. Freeman remained seated for a long moment before standing. He walked toward the jury, moving slowly, deliberately. Then he spoke. "You know," he said, "I've been in a lot of movies over the years." He paused, but not a single one of them was about letting people get away with what they knew was wrong. He turned toward Ripley. "Mr. Ripley knew what he was doing. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd take a payout like all the others. He thought he could steal a piece of my land, turn it into luxury AI labs, and walk away richer for it. He let that hang in the air. You're here today because justice isn't about money. It isn't about how expensive your lawyer is or how many degrees you hold." He looked at the jury, locking eyes with each of them. "It's about doing what's right." He took a step back. "That's all I have to say." As he walked back to his seat, the weight of his words settled over the room. Judge Winters nodded solemnly. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow, when the jury will deliver its verdict." And with that, the battle neared its end. The courtroom was silent the following morning. The buzz that had filled the room on previous days replaced by a tense anticipation. Today, the trial would take its most decisive turn yet. Judge Patricia Winters took her seat and adjusted her glasses, looking more serious than she had since the case began. "Mr. Freeman, do you have any further witnesses before we move to closing arguments?" she asked, her tone now respectful where once it had been mocking. Morgan Freeman stood steady as ever. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Ms. Sophia Chen to the stand." The name was unfamiliar to most in the courtroom, but it immediately sent a ripple of unease through the defense table. Victoria Parker frowned, glancing at her client, Alexander Ripley, who looked equally confused. "Who the hell is Sophia Chen?" Ripley whispered. Parker shook her head. "No idea." Then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A woman in her early 30s walked in, dressed in a simple dark suit, her face composed but tense. Her straight black hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she carried a small laptop case. As she made her way to the stand, Ripley's face suddenly drained of color. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, so low only Parker could hear. The court clerk swore Chen in, and once she was settled, Freeman approached, his pace slow and deliberate. "Ms. Chen," Freeman began, his voice as steady as ever, "could you tell the court what you do for a living?" Chen cleared her throat. "I'm a software engineer specializing in AI ethics. I've been in the field for 10 years. "And who have you worked for recently?" Chen shifted slightly, glancing at Ripley before exhaling. "NeuralSphere Corporation. I was a senior ethics auditor for their NeuralCore project." A murmur spread through the room. Parker stood instantly. "Your Honor, I object. This witness wasn't disclosed to the defense." Judge Winters raised an eyebrow at Freeman. "Mr. Freeman," Freeman nodded. "Your Honor, Ms. Chen came forward last night of her own accord. She wasn't originally part of my witness list, but after hearing the testimony so far, she realized something." Freeman turned toward Chen. "Tell the court what you realized." Chen swallowed hard and then looked straight at the judge. "I realized I didn't want to be part of a cover-up." The courtroom erupted into gasps. Judge Winters banged her gavel. "Order!" Parker's face had turned pale. Ripley, meanwhile, had stiffened like a man seeing a ghost. Freeman folded his arms. "Ms. Chen, let's be clear. You're saying there was a cover-up?" Chen nodded. "Yes, sir." Freeman walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. "These are the original permits and construction plans submitted to the city for NeuralSphere's development. Can you confirm that these are the correct documents?" Chen took the folder, flipping through the pages. After a moment, she nodded. "Yes, these were the official plans." Freeman leaned in slightly. "And was there ever a second set of plans?" Chen hesitated, glancing toward Ripley. The tech CEO's face was turning red with anger. Finally, Chen sighed. "Yes," she said. "There was a second set of plans. They weren't officially filed, but they included modifications, changes to push the property lines." More murmurs from the crowd. Parker jumped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. We have no evidence of these so-called second plans." Judge Winters turned to Chen. "Do you have proof of these altered plans?" Chen reached into her laptop case and pulled out a USB flash drive. "Yes, Your Honor. I made a backup of all the project files before I left the company. These documents show two different versions of the same project, one legal, one not." Parker looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. Ripley, on the other hand, was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Judge Winters gestured to the bailiff, who took the flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. "We'll have this examined immediately," Winters said, before turning back to Chen. "Ms. Chen, are you saying that Mr. Ripley was fully aware that his project was encroaching on Mr. Freeman's land?" Chen hesitated but then nodded. "Yes, he knew. We all knew. The ethics team raised concerns about the boundary issue, but we were told to focus on AI safety protocols and ignore the real estate technicalities." Freeman turned to the jury, letting those words settle. Then he looked back at Chen. "Why are you telling the truth now?" Chen exhaled, looking down at her hands. "Because I watched this trial. I saw Mr. Freeman standing up there alone, just trying to get justice. And I thought about what I'd been taught about ethics in tech. That it's not just about the code we write, but about how we conduct ourselves as an industry." She looked up, her eyes now steady. I realize that's the kind of integrity I should have. A beat of silence passed before Freeman gave a small nod. No further questions? Judge Winters turned to Parker. Ms. Parker, do you wish to cross-examine? Parker looked at Ripley, then back at the judge. She hesitated for a long moment before sighing. No, Your Honor. Judge Winters nodded. Very well. This court will take a brief recess before moving forward. She banged her gavel, and the courtroom immediately erupted into conversation. As Freeman walked back to his seat, Parker and Ripley whispered furiously at the defense table. What the hell just happened? Ripley hissed. You said we had this under control. Parker rubbed her face. That was before your ethics officer flipped on us. She exhaled. We're in trouble, Alexander. Across the room, Freeman sat back in his chair, watching them. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting, because he knew what was coming next. And Ripley did too. For the first time since the trial began, the defense knew they were going to lose. The tension in the Santa Monica County courtroom was palpable as the judge called for a recess. Spectators filed out, buzzing with whispered speculation. Reporters rushed to their phones, typing furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves. Star witness flips, Freeman's case takes stunning turn. Ripley's Believe It or Not, Tech, CEO's scheme exposed in court. Freeman's lone fight for justice gains unexpected ally. Inside the courthouse, Morgan Freeman remained seated at his table, unaffected by the media storm outside. He had spent his life playing characters who could outweigh any opponent, and today was no different. He sipped his water occasionally, glancing at Alexander Ripley, who was locked in a furious conversation with his attorney, Victoria Parker. Ripley's face was red with anger. Fix this, he hissed under his breath. We cannot lose this case. Parker sighed, rubbing her temple. We may not have a choice, Alexander. When Sophia Chen worked for you, did you ever consider she would keep backup files? She signed an NDA. That doesn't matter anymore, Parker said, her voice low but firm. She's under oath now and she has evidence. The jury saw your reaction when she walked in. You looked guilty before she even spoke. When the court reconvened, the jurors filed back in, their expressions serious. The gravity of what had just happened was evident. A key witness, Ripley's own ethics officer, had exposed damning evidence of deliberate encroachment. And now, with new digital records submitted for review, the truth was becoming impossible to bury. Judge Patricia Winters leaned forward, her voice carrying more weight than before. Court is now back in session. In light of the new evidence presented, the jury has requested additional time to deliberate. She looked at Freeman and then at Ripley. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for the verdict. She banged her gavel one final time, and the courtroom began to empty. As Freeman gathered his papers, he felt a presence beside him. He looked up to see Sophia Chen standing there, looking both relieved and exhausted. Mr. Freeman, she said quietly, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. Freeman studied her for a moment. You did the right thing, Ms. Chen. That takes courage. They'll blacklist me in the industry, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Silicon Valley protects its own. Freeman nodded. Sometimes doing what's right comes with a cost, but there are always people who value integrity over power. He handed her his card. When this is over, give me a call. I know some people who might appreciate someone with your principles. Chen took the card, a small smile forming on her lips. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. She turned to leave, then paused. You know, I grew up watching your movies. My dad always said you played men of honor. Turns out that wasn't just acting. The following morning, the courthouse was surrounded by media and spectators. The line to get into the courtroom stretched around the block. Inside, every seat was filled as Judge Winters called the court to order. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked, her voice solemn. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor, stood. We have, Your Honor. Judge Winters nodded toward the bailiff, who took the verdict form from the foreman and delivered it to the judge. Winters took a moment to examine it before turning back to the court. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Winters said, her voice steady, the jury has returned with a verdict. Please be seated. The courtroom sat in hushed anticipation the air thick with uncertainty. Judge Winters glanced at the envelope one last time before beginning to read aloud. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Morgan Freeman. We find that the defendant, Alexander Ripley and NeuralSphere Corporation, have knowingly encroached upon the plaintiff's property and have acted in bad faith by ignoring repeated requests to cease construction. A stunned silence followed the judge's words. Freeman didn't react immediately. He simply sat, his face as calm as ever, letting the words sink in. The court awards the plaintiff full compensation for the damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages for the defendant's willful disregard of property law. The court erupted into murmurs. Reporters scrambled to file the story. The room buzzed with shock, disbelief, and awe. Alexander Ripley, on the other hand, froze, his face drained of color as the implications of the verdict settled in. He had lost completely. The case that he had once dismissed as a mere nuisance, the trial he had thought he could control, had turned into a public humiliation. Your Honor, Ripley's voice quivered, but he quickly regained some semblance of composure. We request an immediate stay of execution. This verdict is... Judge Winters held up a hand, cutting him off. The jury's decision is final, Mr. Ripley. Any motions to delay or appeal will need to be filed through the proper channels. She looked at Freeman. Mr. Freeman, would you like to make a statement before we conclude today's proceedings? Freeman stood slowly, his movements measured. His calm presence seemed to command the room, and for a moment all eyes were on him. I've spent a lot of time in courts on screen, of course, Freeman said, his voice carrying across the room. But this time, I wasn't playing a role. I wasn't acting. I was standing up for what's right. He paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to Ripley. Mr. Ripley took my land, and he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could ignore the law, silence the truth, and walk away with no consequences. He looked back at the jury. But the law caught up with him, and today, you made sure that justice prevailed. There was a brief silence, and then a murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Freeman continued, his tone steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. This wasn't just about property. This was about standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy. And I want to thank the jury for having the courage to do that. He turned toward the judge. No further comments, Your Honor. Judge Winters nodded, her expression softening. The court acknowledges the verdict. The defendant is hereby ordered to pay the awarded damages in full, as well as the legal fees of the plaintiff. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room exploded into noise. Reporters surged forward, eager to catch Freeman's words, while Ripley's defense team scrambled to process the outcome. Freeman didn't linger. He stood, nodded to the judge, and began walking toward the exit. As he passed Ripley's table, their eyes met briefly. Freeman didn't speak. He didn't need to. The verdict spoke louder than any words could. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Reporters surrounded Freeman as he stepped into the sunlight, their microphones thrust toward him, their cameras flashing. But Freeman simply held up his hand, signaling for them to pause. He took a deep breath, his expression solemn, then looked into the nearest camera. Justice was done today, he said, his distinctive voice carrying over the crowd's murmur. But this isn't just about one man getting what he's owed. This is about every person who's had their rights ignored, their voices silenced. I'm here today to say that we all deserve justice, no matter who we are. As Freeman began to walk away, a young reporter called out, Mr. Freeman, what will you do with the land now? Freeman paused, turning back. I'm going to preserve it. That cottage, it's where my wife and I spent our last summer together before she passed. Some things are worth more than money. The revelation sent another wave of activity through the press corps. This personal detail, this emotional connection that Freeman had kept private throughout the trial, suddenly cast the entire case in a new light. It wasn't just about property lines. It was about memory, legacy, and what we choose to fight for. 3 months later, Alexander Ripley stood at the window of his penthouse office, staring out at the San Francisco skyline. The fallout from the trial had been swift and merciless. NeuralSphere's stock had plummeted. Investors had pulled out. The SEC had launched an investigation into the company's business practices following anonymous tips. Tips that many suspected came from Sophia Chen. Ripley's phone buzzed. It was his new lawyer. "The settlement with the other property owners is finalized," the lawyer said, "but it's going to cost us another $20 million. "Fine," Ripley replied tersely. "Just make it go away." Since the verdict, 5 other property owners had come forward with similar complaints against NeuralSphere. Rather than face more public trials, Ripley had chosen to settle. It was cheaper than losing again. It was cheaper than the continued damage to his reputation. As he hung up, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Ripley, Mississippi Chen is here to see you." Ripley spun around. "Chen? What the hell is she doing here? I don't want to see her." But before his assistant could respond, Sophia Chen walked into the office, followed by 2 people Ripley didn't recognize, a man and a woman in business attire. "Hello, Alexander," Chen said calmly. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here with an opportunity." "An opportunity?" Ripley laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my company." "No, your decisions did that," Chen replied. "But you still have valuable technology, and these people represent the Freeman Foundation." "Freeman Foundation?" Ripley repeated. "Morgan Freeman took his settlement money and started a nonprofit," Chen explained. "They're focused on ethical tech development and community land rights. They're offering to partner with what's left of NeuralSphere to help rebuild it with better principles." Ripley stared at her in disbelief. "Why would Freeman help me after everything?" "He's not helping you," Chen said simply. "He's helping the hundreds of employees who didn't do anything wrong but lost their jobs anyway. He's helping the technology reach its potential without harming communities. This isn't about you, Alexander. It's about doing what's right." Ripley sank into his chair, the fight suddenly gone from him. "And what's my role in all this?" "That depends on whether you've learned anything," Chen said. "The Foundation wants someone who understands the technology, but also respects boundaries, both ethical and physical." For the first time in months, maybe years, Alexander Ripley felt something shift inside him. The arrogance that had carried him through life, the belief that rules were for other people. It all suddenly seemed hollow. "I'll need time to think about it," he said finally. Chen nodded. "That's fair. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready to talk like a human being instead of an algorithm." Meanwhile in Malibu, Morgan Freeman sat on the porch of the small cottage, watching the sunset over the Pacific. The adjacent land, where Ripley's facility had begun to rise, was now cleared and restored to its natural state. In the distance, a family of deer grazed peacefully. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Judge Patricia Winters approaching. He raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Winters sat down with a sigh. "Figured I owed you a proper conversation, Mr. Freeman. I misjudged you at the start of that trial." Freeman studied her for a moment. "You weren't the only one." "I've been a judge for 25 years, Winters continued. "Seen all kinds of cases, all kinds of people. But what you did, standing up to Ripley, to the system, to me, it made me think about why I became a judge in the first place." "And why was that?" Freeman asked. "To make sure justice was served." She looked out at the setting sun. "Somewhere along the way, I started forgetting that." Freeman nodded. "It's easy to forget. The system, it can make you cynical." "Well, consider this an official acknowledgement that I was wrong," Winters said, extending her hand. Freeman shook it firmly. "Appreciate that." Winters glanced at the cottage. "So this is what you were fighting for?" "Part of it," Freeman replied. "My wife loved this place. We'd sit right here watching the sunset. She made me promise to protect it." He smiled faintly. "But I was also fighting for something bigger, a principle." "What's next for you?" Winters asked. "Back to making movies?" Freeman chuckled. "Eventually, but right now I'm focused on the foundation. We're helping other communities stand up to corporate overreach. And believe it or not, we might even work with what's left of Ripley's company." Winters raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" "After everything, justice isn't just about punishment," Freeman said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's about redemption too, about giving people a chance to do better." As Judge Winters walked back to her car, Freeman remained on the porch, hands in his pockets, looking out over his land. The fight was over. The dust had settled. And once again, he had proven that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand their ground. The world would keep moving. Corporations would keep trying to cheat the system. People like Ripley would rise and fall. But as long as there were men and women willing to fight for what was right, people like Sophia Chen, who risked everything for the truth, justice would always have a chance. Freeman smiled as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. His wife would have been proud, not just of him protecting their special place, but of the ripples that simple act of defiance had created. Ripples that were already changing lives far beyond his own. With one last glance at the peaceful land around him, Freeman stood up and walked inside his cottage, leaving the story of his courtroom victory to inspire others for years to come. And somewhere out there, someone else was watching, learning, and finding the courage to take their own stand against injustice.